Greetings, everyone. My name is Cory Bradford-Watts, and I am the host of the Transcendiots, the Swedenborg Foundation webcast. And as you may know, the goal of the Transcendiots is to uplift ourselves and each other through connecting with other folks and hearing about their lives and spiritual journeys. And so today we are quite blessed to learn a little bit more about Kent Rogers, the author of 7 Days of Spiritual Evolution, the Genesis of Personal Transformation. It is a fantastic read. We'll have the link to it in the description of the video. And so welcome, Kent.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Nice to be here.
Oh, our honor. Now, where are we today? Let's set the scene for those watching.
So this beautiful space is the meditation garden on the campus of the Lord's New Church, Philadelphia Society. All are welcome anytime. It's a absolutely gorgeous piece of heaven, and just clears your mind. And we're blessed to be in this space.
Yeah. Maybe I'll do a little turnaround with the camera at the end so they can see how amazing this place is.
It's a good idea.
Thanks for introducing me to this lovely spot and us to this warm area. It's nice to be outside connecting with folks. And what's on your mind on this beautiful day?
Well, it's my anniversary.
Oh,
yeah.
Really?
Yep.
Congratulations.
Thank you. So, Sova, love you. She's on my mind.
Wow.
Yeah.
And you met Shova at an orphanage that you worked with.
Yeah.
Tell us about that orphanage.
All right, so it was called Loving Arms Mission, and it's still happening in Nepal. And basically, someone wanted to create a new church orphanage in Nepal where they had lived before, and they needed someone to fundraise. So I had just graduated out of college and had a very powerful experience that I knew was a calling to do something hands-on to help people in need. So this answered that calling perfectly. So I said, I will definitely do that. And then, due to a series of circumstances, the people who were going to be the mother and father who had dreamed up the idea were no longer able to do it. So we had already raised this money, and so we looked into various options, and then I said, okay, I'll go for 3 years, set it up, get Nepali staff, and come home.
Wow.
So went over there, was working alongside Sova, and we fell in love, and we married, and then we decided to be the permanent mother and father. So the moral is watch out. God will rope you into a lot more responsibility than it looks at first. It was beautiful. We did it like a family, so we had 10 orphans, and we raised them from when they were young until they were in their 20s, and at which point we came back to the U.S. And 6 years after we began, we opened a second home with a different mom and dad, and that home will still be open probably for 4 more years, and then their kids will all be in the 20s. So now I'm back to fundraising.
Really?
Yeah, so
it's
you're
exciting.
welcome to donate. We'll always accept.
Oh, yeah, please do.
Put in my
Well,
plug.
no. How could they donate if they wanted to?
We have a website, it's called lambchildren.org, and we also have a Facebook page. You have to be careful because recently there's another Loving Arms Mission organization that has very similar functions. So you have to make sure it's for Nepal kids, and we have our logo is a blue colored. It's like a mother holding a baby. So if you see that, that's the right.
Great. Frog?
Yeah.
Oh, that's great. There's frogs just sitting out here singing to this beautiful day. Well, you mentioned God sometimes roping us into things without us quite knowing what's coming or being ready for it, seemingly at least.
Yeah.
How does that idea of providence, of God at work in your life, speak to you? How do you think about that?
I think it's comprehensive. I think that every external event and every thought is leading of God, and it looks different for everybody. But I told you about some controversy over some of my ideas earlier, but
we love controversy.
Okay.
You want to bring up
I'm in the right place.
Yeah.
But if you read through the Third Testament, we call it the Third Testament writings
of Emanuel Swedenborg,
yeah,
18th century mystic, scientist turned mystical theologian. Yeah, that guy.
He talks about freedom as the ability to follow through with what we want to do. That's what freedom is. And he lists different levels of motivation. And he says, but true freedom is when we're filled with selfless love, and that's only from the Lord. And then he describes how our love is purified from being pure selfishness to actual love for other people and gratitude and love for the Lord. And the process involves the Lord basically secretly leading us from within. So, like the book says, evolving us. Right? We are evolved, and it seems like we are doing the hard work, and it has to seem like that, and we have to force ourselves to do things. But while we do that, it's very clear, again, in the writings of Swedenborg, that we must understand and acknowledge that the Lord does every single thing in the entire process. And then
God does all the good work and
yeah.
progress within our spirit and life.
Yeah, and sometimes it says even the choices. Like, we'll look back and we'll realize, oh, I thought I was making that choice, but actually that was God too. So the way I see it is God does absolutely everything, but through an absolute tremendous miracle, we are given to feel alive. And the way that can be is that love is put into our heart and spirit, and we act from that selfless love, and that's joy, and there's peace there too. So we love it. And so people say, well, doesn't that make you a robot if everything is controlled by God? But I feel like that's not understanding what love's all about. The more you get into the midst of love and love into the midst of you, the less robotic we become. We get more and more alive, just like evolution. Like we have a lot more freedom and sense of aliveness than a bug, I assume, or the frog over there.
So you believe in scientific ideas like evolution and things like that, and this type of hands-on approach by God. Yeah. How would you describe that? How would you describe science in relation to divinity?
Well, I feel like this is actually a topic that's been on my mind a lot, like the nature of the natural world. So we know it's continually sustained from spiritual influx. It looks like cause and effect happens through time, but I believe from what I read and thinking about it that really cause and effect is a horizontal or a vertical relationship from spirit into our perceptions. So I think that what science does is it examines the exterior membrane called the natural experience that we are in. And what it discovers there represents or is a sort of a two-dimensional vision of three-dimensional reality, which is something spiritual. So again, evolution is a vision of something that happens in our spirit, and that's fundamentally more real than natural evolution, but they are corresponding to each other.
Yeah, so that internal evolution that we really feel is more real than even this real external evolution.
Yeah.
Partly because we're actually, that's actually our experience. Experience is something pretty heavy, or how would you describe why that's more?
Why is it more? Because spirit is where love is. Spirit is where wisdom wisdom really is just saying, understanding how to be loving and what love is. So love is life. Anyone who has, which is everyone, has felt love would know that love is actually more real than something you can touch. It is life. It's, would you rather have love in your life or the most wonderful sense experience you could have? I would say love is going to trump every sense experience we can have, right?
Yeah.
So
it's like the spark that gave way to the Big Bang. Like it's the underlying force of the universe.
Yeah, exactly. So as a cause, it's more real than this, which is the effect. So yeah, to me, natural worlds, I guess the best way I could say it is it's a ever-opening revelation of God's love for us and all life in general. I mean, it's really gorgeous. You gotta admit it.
That's perfect. Perfect setting then. Thank you for putting that so beautifully. I'm curious, do those ideas inform your work in this book?
Yeah, I would say they're intimately related with several of the ideas here.
Well, you mentioned evolution. What are you doing in this book to speak towards personal evolution? What's the structure of 7 Days of Spiritual Evolution?
Yeah, okay, so it's really based on the 7 days of creation, and it goes through that first chapter of Genesis, verse by verse, and then takes a look at it. And Swedenborg does the exact same thing. And I guess my goal is, in creating a separate book, it's kind of like, well, somebody already did that. But for one thing,
your approach is really different. I loved it. So.
I wanted to make it in language that is very understandable and very connected to experiences that we all know and relate to, rather than just ideas. So that was one goal. And then the other goal was, so we were talking about whether the writings of Swedenborg can have multiple meanings, like different meanings based on the different minds that approach it and read it. So rather than just reading and saying this is the way it is, I wanted to look at the same story with a solid foundation on what I've read in Swedenborg, but try to let God speak to me personally through the same story. So there's overlap, and then there are places where there's some divergence.
It also seems, through reading the book, it seems like you are using Swedenborg's ideas to inform, to some degree, your own interpretation, and putting it maybe in a light or at an angle that speaks to some of your background in psychotherapy and work like that. Would you say that's true?
Yeah, that's true. So that's one of the ways that I wanted it to be not just ideas, but applicable. So therapy, I loved doing therapy, But so often I felt like my hands were tied because I felt like what was the greatest healing tool that you could put within therapy would be access to the divine, a sense of God's love in one's life. So I wanted to bring those spiritual ideas into play with the tools that psychotherapy offers and show how they actually complement one another very, very well. That these tools can be used as spiritual tools, and also that you can see there's actually hiding within a lot of the tools of psychotherapy spiritual principles, you could say. Just put they're sort of disguised in secular language.
I've heard that a couple times from people who do counseling or therapy, and also have a deep spiritual walk, that they wish, or that they're trying to create space for, um, you know, bringing the two together. And often I saw this study when I was in seminary about people who went to psychotherapists who also had like a spiritual director or like a pastor who would connect with them in that way. And they kept saying that I wish I could go to the same place for both of these, right? And so it sounds like you wanted to bring them together, which I think is natural.
Yeah, I look forward to, now that I'm moving on to a role as a pastor. Once established, hopefully I will get people seeking pastoral counseling, and then that will be beautiful when I can really wed the two together in a service to someone who wants them together.
That's cool.
I'm excited about that.
Oh, good. That's great. I wish you God's luck, good luck with that work. And
thank you.
What's that path like for you? The path to becoming a minister, a pastor?
It's long in the coming. I think I started in 95 or 6, and because of some of the things I was talking about, that path got waylaid here and there, and I'm glad it did. I feel like I said, everything is on the course that it's supposed to be on, and I can see in retrospect, some of the bumps on the road were a little painful, but in retrospect, I can see that I think I'm going to be a lot better of a pastor than I could have been if I hadn't had some of the experiences that I went through.
Oh. So. Yeah, friction helps you to grow.
Yeah, I had plenty of that.
The example I've heard is, the piece of sand in the clam,
yeah,
right, creates the pearl,
yeah,
through friction, yeah,
and that's the gate to the holy city.
Yeah, the pearl of the gate.
Yep.
Wow. Huh. Great connection. That's cool.
Yeah.
This is the holy city in described in Revelation, right?
Yes. Right. The final chapters of the Bible, where finally all the war and the killing and the crying and everything is finally done, and we get to enjoy, the fruit of the labor. And I think that, that's the pearl after all that being irritated and trying to become a better person, and it never works. I think it's no coincidence that it's pearls.
That's incredible. That's cool.
It's beautiful.
One, I love the description of those gates because it says there's 3 gates on each side of the city and people streaming in essentially from different directions.
Yeah.
Kind of speaking to the diversity of heaven, you think? The diversity of people who can connect to God in their own way. Yeah.
Hear, hear.
Hear, hear. Yeah, that's awesome. Well, it actually relates to a question I wanted to ask you earlier. Do you think God is uplifting evolution, spiritual evolution, in people of different faiths? Like, a lot of Swedenborgians know that Swedenborg's theology is very much focused on how the perfection of heaven comes through diversity, and we can all connect to God. even in our different traditions.
Yeah.
Yeah, would you agree, and tell me what you think about that?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's such a beautiful idea that it's almost, how could it not be true that God is in the lives of all people, leading them as is best for that person. And so, the question comes, well, why does it look like some people are, evil or stuck in evil? And, if I was that person, I would be that person too, and why are some people good? Well, if I was that person, I would be that, you know what I mean? It's like we are who we are, and God uses the genetics, environment, upbringing, and exposure to spiritual ideas that we have, and He works with those to progress us. And some are blessed with a lot of love in their upbringing and nurturing and exposure to fantastic ideas about how to become a better person and why. And others don't have that, but I don't think they're going to be judged for not having a good upbringing or exposure to good truth.
Mm-hmm. Well, clearly you're passionate about connecting with folks and trying to uplift them wherever they're at. I mean, I think that's what this book is about in a way.
Yeah.
And I find it very helpful in that regard. So even though God is working in everyone's life, we can still, focus on our spiritual health and grow in that way, and that's good, right? To find greater health.
Yeah, and that's where the rubber hits the road, and this is, it happens through our sense of agency. So, it's not a conveyor belt. It's works through us. So I need to learn and I need to apply. And when I do that, it feels exactly like I'm doing it. But at the same time, I know, actually, I'm motivated to do it by something. What is that? I can't say it's really me. I was given a motivation to read or to apply to the extent I do those things. And that's, same with all people. So
you were given strength to do it, right?
Yeah, and motivation. That motivation might feel like, oh, I'm going to do this, I want to do this, but I don't see it that way. I think any motivation to do any forward or progress towards becoming a loving person, a person that allows God's love to flow through, is only by God's mercy. So, and yet we still have to do the work. The information is not just going to suddenly be in my mind, and I'm not just going to suddenly be doing something good for other people. I still have to do it. These hands have to do it. These eyes have to read. So yeah, we have to work.
Well, it's kind of like natural evolution, where these things, this life had to go through process and go through growth and death and new birth to get where we are today. But it seems like it's these things doing it, but it's kind of the Lord at work in creation, you're saying.
Absolutely. Yeah. And there was a part of this book that we couldn't figure out where to put it in. It was going to be the foreword, but it's too long. And I said, why don't we just get rid of it? Because this doesn't really... So they put it as an afterthought. And basically, it's this wonderful, interesting fact of natural evolution, which is, if you look at from the moment of the Big Bang, or whatever, at the beginning, you have this quark soup, and then the quarks get together, and when they do, they form like nuclei, which has mass, and a quark, there's no mass except when they get together, and then nuclei has basically no space, but when you put an electron around it, suddenly it creates the shell that occupies space and has something that other things can run into. And then it keeps going every step of the way. Things that have less reality and less properties get together to form something more real, you could say, and because it has more properties.
Wow.
And then when it gets to biology, the same thing. Like there's cells, and then inside those cells are the mitochondria, and then that symbiotic relationship. They're a cluster of cells to form simple, and it just keeps going until you have human beings, and even like the system of plant life and animal life, they're symbiotic. But it's all these symbiotic relationships where lesser things are joining together to become more amazing forms. And
it's only really lesser in relative to what it becomes together in a way, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's cool.
And then there's human consciousness, which is, again, it's a step way above just physical reality. We can go anywhere in our mind. We've Transcendiots, we are able to transcend
our idiocy.
Yeah, our idiocy.
Sometimes, hopefully.
But
we're working on it, right?
But in that pattern, you can see how it's the pattern of love, where love is bringing things together to make them more amazing. So, like, even a relationship between two people, that is much more amazing than any one person alone. And again, it's this pattern from the beginning of time to now of love revealing itself in that ever-opening flower.
Wow.
So.
Yeah. And so, of course, you relate that to our own internal growth journeys and how, there's different places that we can advance and see some real progress, some real evolutionary change, and be relatively greater in a sense.
Yeah.
Especially, I think, just making this a little more personal, looking back at my own journey, and I think for other people, you see how you used to be or how you used to behave or feel, what your motivations were, and then you say, wow, I've grown a lot and I still have a long way to go, right?
Yeah. I'm grateful I'm not that guy
Yeah.
anymore. He still shows up sometimes, but not as often.
Wow. Well, that's something I think that applies to so many different ways that people approach living. People find it in self-care approaches, and it could be why we meditate. It could be why we go to church, go to the mosque. Why do you think there is such diversity in approaches to spirituality?
To reveal love. Love is infinite. I mean, love and God are the same thing. So God is infinite, and so to reveal God, to reveal love, is different ways of looking at it. But how can an infinite reality express itself in mortal beings or in space and time? And the only answer is through incredible diversity, ever-expanding diversity. So it would surely be boring if we were all the same.
I love that. In a way, it kind of inspires us to look around and appreciate nature, other people, etc., as expressions of God and God's love, and to value them as such, right?
Yeah.
Hope to connect and uplift them as such, and ourselves as well.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah, I like that.
Yeah, I love how you described how it's God at work in our good motivations and our positive progress and everything involved with that, the strength, etc. Because I think it helps to devolve or disconnect our ego from what we have going on that's working for us. And often I think that's hard, and it calls on us to try to divest it.
Yeah, I mean, I agree, and I think that's fundamentally central and vital to our spiritual walk. That eventually we get to the point where we don't necessarily detach from it all. You mentioned meditation. That's a really helpful tool, and putting, it's not necessarily the real deal, but it's a window onto the falsity of the ego, or the fact that the self isn't what we think it is. That we're not the doer that we think we are. So it opens the window to let us see that, and then it helps us to actually start trying to apply it and live it and believe it when we're not meditating too. So,
Helpful practice.
Yeah, absolutely. And being egoless is it's easy to talk about.
There's only one, well, one whole that is egoless, but that one whole enlivens all of us. So there's hope.
That's a great way of putting it.
So you meditate. Could you share, describe one of your meditation practices?
Yeah, sure. Is it all right if I do two?
Please, if you want to lead us in one, that would be even better. Can I put you one on the spot? You can.
Well, how long do you want?
Just a moment or two.
Very moment.
That might be tough with meditation.
Yeah, I'll just describe them.
Great.
So one is to read scripture, especially stories that have an emotional content, a strong element of interpersonal contact, whether that be between two characters or with the Lord. From scriptures, read it, and then put oneself into the shoes of one of the characters, and go through it as deeply as you can. Like, so you get yourself into a meditative state, enter into that character, and walk through the story, being that character. And it's amazing what can come out of that practice.
Oh, it's incredible.
So it's a great way to meet the Lord. If you really feel like I need a way to contact the Lord, if you go into the New Testament and read a story, if you feel like you're blind, you can't see, put yourself in the eyes of or shoes of one of the blind people, and you pick your story. It's a really powerful tool.
Oh.
And then there's one which is actually a Buddhist practice called loving kindness meditation. And you get yourself again into a meditative state, and then you visualize people, nature, whatever you want, and you just focus your entire mind, being onto wishing well or blessing the other. And that's a kind of a visual prayer or a nonverbal prayer. And I think it's going to be good for the meditator, but I believe that our prayers, I've seen prayers be answered in amazing ways, so I think it really does bless the recipient of such a meditation.
Wow. That's powerful. Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. It's a lot of good meditations out there.
Yeah. Well, that's inspired me to say maybe we take a moment and wish well to our listeners or watchers.
Sounds good.
Yeah. thank you.
You know what's amazing about this is that it shows the transcendent nature of love. They're going to be seeing it at a different time, in a different space, and yet I felt really connected.
That's cool.
So maybe some of them were in turn meditating goodwill onto you and I, and we were feeling that. Who knows?
Yeah.
But love doesn't have to abide by space and time.
Yeah, that's a good point. And as we're learning with quantum physics, right, some of the limitations to what we call classical physics, or the way things often seem, aren't always true deep down in the universe, you could say, or inherently in the universe. And, do you think of quantum physics as in some way representing or symbolically showing certain aspects of love in a sense?
Yeah,
You probably think that about every level
yeah.
of physics, right?
I don't think there's anything that doesn't somehow reveal love. If it didn't, it wouldn't exist. So, yes. And I also feel like it's interesting because we're pushing to the edge of physical reality to the point where it's almost not physical reality anymore. You know, things are disappearing and reappearing and disassembling into probability patterns and then showing up again in a certain
Quantum physics.
Is that really physical reality anymore? It's like we're right at the edge or something.
It's almost that idea that in the small particles that are described in quantum physics, and of course we're we're enveloped in them right now. That's how we're communicating. But they're in a sense in probability patterns, as you put it, distributions until an interaction or until an exchange of energy, and then they in a sense solidify. But even that could be interpreted differently, right? But to me, that description, it's almost like a description of freedom. Like even particles have, it's not classical physics where if you do X and Y, of course Z will appear. It's a little cloudier, spooky action at a distance, as Einstein put it, described by quantum physics, that there's actually kind of a choice being made by each particle. But how does freedom, or that idea of freedom, speak to you in creation as a whole?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I've heard like atheistic physicists say, well, maybe this is how human freedom exists. Somehow we're manipulating. So, as I said, my vision of what freedom means is a little different. I feel like freedom is love, or it's an inherent quality of love. So
the more we act out of love, maybe even the more the sense of freedom we have.
Yeah, precisely.
Yeah. Real freedom we have.
Yeah, real freedom. That's when we get real freedom. Before that, we believe we have this choose left or right type of freedom. But if you think about it, really, we're motivated to choose one or the other. It's the motivation making the choice. And are you going to say that motivation is who you are, or is it something flowing into you? I don't mean to go back there, but...
Well, also, are you going to settle for maybe some destructive motivations, or are you going to lean into some spiritual evolution? Hopefully.
Right, and it's, again, we got to do the work as if it's ourselves, but it's, in Swedenborg, every page you'll read about the as if of self. You do the work as if it is your selfhood doing it, knowing that God's doing it. So if quantum physics is representing real freedom in the sense that we typically think of it, then it would have to be love, because only love is freedom. So I don't have a firm idea about how it fits together.
Yeah, it would have to be, well, not only symbolic, but largely symbolic. If we were to look at quantum physics and relate it to our own life, because that's how we do everything. Like you said, it's powerful when we take a narrative, especially one that that has some emotional content and maybe even connects with God, and then we internalize it in some way and learn from it. I think quantum physics could work that way, and many other things, as your book points out. But one thing that I think relates to that within quantum physics is, you know, two particles can become entangled so that they're not necessarily exactly the same, but they react together even across vast distances.
So
You know, so,
amazing.
yeah, and I'm like, well, that sounds like love to me, like this deep
Ah,
connection, right?
I like that. That's great.
And if it's true, I don't know, but if the Big Bang was how everything started, there's some type of residual connection, maybe deep down, maybe even just historically, but I think it's probably bigger than that, of everything. If we all started from a single point, you know.
Yeah, and I mean, I'm not convinced that. Well, I'm pretty convinced that time isn't what we think it is. So,
Yeah.
the Big Bang and right now are probably even on a I mean, outside of time and space in the realm of spirit, everything is simultaneous. But even on this natural plane, I feel like they probably are going to realize everything is always simultaneous. Maybe they already have, but that's my intuition. That
Huh.
everything is right now. It sounds pretty corny.
Well, I'm curious, actually. I'm intrigued. So you would say, I'm going to start at the top. So
Okay.
you would say God has this perspective of everything, God, everything already happened or is happening always, or um, that God's outside of time because God created time. Yeah, and that kind of idea connects with spiritual realm. I'm curious. Describe something else about that idea to me. If I can,
Which I had
if I can
brought it
just
up.
open up a big.
uh,
Well, we'll talk about God in that if you don't mind.
yeah, well, I. Okay. So, if you live your life and you don't know what's going on, like somebody's leading you here and there, and then you have to go through the rain and you're stepping in puddles and you're irritated with this guy who's leading you somewhere, and then you get to this weird dark alley and we're almost there, and then they open the door and there's a big surprise party for you. So I feel like that's what life's like. And once you're at the surprise party, you realize, oh, that's why everything happened the way it did. And therefore time is different than we thought it was. We thought it was serially going from A to B to C, but when we get to Z, we realize Z was the starting point because that guy knew where we were headed. So that's kind of how I see it. And
That was worth the trip down the alleyway. Just getting that answer, that was good. You have something else to say about it. I want to hear that too.
I guess the other thing is, I lost the thought.
If it comes to you, let us know. Yeah. That's cool, though. I appreciate you taking some space to reflect on that for me because, yeah, that's something I've thought about in a peripheral way, especially the God knowing where you're going to end and kind of using every moment to uplift you as much as she can. And I think that's amazing that could be reality and that the evidence in my life speaks more and more to that. It's not something I always believed in.
Yeah.
Do you think it's empowering to find those types of uh, even parties during our life,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, to be honest, I guess I can only speak for myself. But if I didn't believe that the end is good, and like you said, have some evidence of that, some just amazing things unfold that seem to come from did come from what seemed to be terrible. Life is very dark at times. You know, life is very hard, and if I didn't know that the final end is good, then those dark alleys, I wouldn't bother moving. What's the point? And B, if I ended up in a terrible situation, you know, the end result might not be good. So,
What you just said about not bothering to move reminds me of how some people describe their depression. Just no motivation to move often.
Yeah. And that's exactly what I mean by the spiritual tools are so powerful for mental health issues. And that's not to say that medication and other tools aren't necessary at times. Certainly they are. But to know God and that life is led by God's love and is God's love is certainly an antidepressant, you know.
Yeah.
And without it, life, I've been there. Life is very dark, very depressing. If you don't, when I didn't know that there's a purpose and it's a good one.
And even if you feel like you're finding that purpose, sometimes you go through phases where you're still not feeling that way, right?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
And life continues to be hard.
Yeah. But I think you're right. There's that hope because you have that more of that experience of hope, like in a felt way. Wow. So you wrote this book. You've written another book as well, which I've glanced at, 12 Miracles of Spiritual Growth. Is that a similar type of text?
It's based on the kind of meditation I described, where I preached when I lived in Nepal. This family service, some neighbors and friends would come by sometimes, but and it was born also of a very dark time of my life, and so I would meditate as a character in the New Testament, and I can't remember which I did first. It's the first chapter in there, and it actually came more out. That one came more out of an intellectual quandary of why did the Lord call this woman little dog, basically, is what he calls her. I thought that does not sound like love. How is this loving? So I put myself in a meditative state and put myself into her shoes and walked through the story as vividly as I could. And a pretty surprising and wonderful resolution to that quandary came of why that interchange between Jesus and her occurred, and it was a loving interchange in the end, I could see. So then I started to try the same kind of meditating through other miracles where people encountered the Lord and he healed them, and it was a series of sermons which I turned into the book.
12 Miracles of Spiritual Growth?
Yeah.
Healing.
Healing. 12 Miracles of Spiritual Healing.
Is that wrong?
Yeah.
Oh, publisher. No.
No. Oh no, it is right, and then the subtitle is A Path of Healing from the Gospel.
I didn't know this. Okay, A Path of Healing from the Gospel.
Sorry, Swedenborg Foundation, you got it right.
Hey, it's a nice party for the foundation. Well, I do think that reflecting on our errors and being willing to own up to them is important, and then appreciating the times where things are going right, but allowing ego to divest itself from those moments. Do you think that kind of revelation of growing with God and allowing yourself to mess up, but also being willing to grow, is that one of the key narratives that you feel when you do your meditations on the gospel?
Definitely. It's sort of the central narrative of my life anyways. I'm guessing it's all of our lives messing up, and then in a way, that's where we get to realize God's love is that we screwed up, but there's still love for us. He's still there's mercy.
There's even providence in those moments. God knowing that we're not always perfect, and sometimes our motivations are somewhat destructive, but um, God's still using those moments if we allow Him to in our lives, but also in other people's lives. How do you kind of, and it's okay if we just reflect on this for a moment together, but how would you explain evil if you had
Okay. So for me, evil is the result of delusion. And the delusion is the result of what is required for love to manifest. That's pretty philosophical. But,
to? Oh, repeat that. Delusion.
right, so the delusion is that we are an autonomous self. We're born into space-time so that we can have individuation. Right? If there's no space-time, there's just God or spirit outside of space and time, then there's just a oneness, right? And then how can love exist? Love has to be two people at least, right? So how can that work? There has to be consciousness bound into the experience of space and time. And then from within that consciousness, because it's isolated from other consciousnesses, it adopts the belief in a selfhood and a self-autonomy and motivation. And that's a delusion. And from that delusion comes selfishness. And it's a delusion we all fall into. That's, in my opinion, what biting the apple in the Garden of Eden is all about. It's, believing that you are God. Because that's what it comes
That's
down
what it
to.
says, right? Like, so you can be like God or be like gods, right? So you're saying it's almost like the delusion of being almost like self-manifesting or owning your own strength is kind of like thinking you're God or,
Yeah, I think that is thinking we're God. When we believe we do the work of our actual selfhood and our self-choice, then that you have to say that's believing you're God.
and that's a very like kind of selfish way, not like, oh, we all have life from God, but more like my will, my way, the id that we're trying to transcend. Sorry, I have to do that.
I would say even if we're using sense of self to make good choices, but we think I'm doing good choices, or regeneration is a Swedenborgian term of improving yourself. If we think we're doing that of our own strength and our own volition, well, then we're still thinking we're God. We're saving ourselves, right? I don't see it that way. So, but we have to, and this actually the first part of this book talks a lot about this. We have to have this sense of self, so that love can be manifest and reified and pass between you and I or any group of people, and between the created and the creator. The only problem with that setup is it leads to this automatic fall into a delusion that the self is God, basically. And then what happens after that is pretty easy to see. I'm going to be fearful. I need to defend myself from you, from everybody. And that will make me violent. And I also am going to be lustful. I need to get more and more and more of whatever I want for myself, and it's going to make me greedy and harm people in my effort to get what I want. And so that's where evil comes from. And the way to overcome evil, in my mind, is to fall onto God with praying for utter mercy and working to overcome the delusion. And, no matter how many times I say it's a delusion, obviously I'm still biting into that delusion to some extent. It's almost impossible not to. I think some people get past this,
but often we have to have awareness that that's our typical pitfall, or at least some awareness of where we want to go to start growing that way. Like you see down the path before you're there.
Yeah.
You know, and there's always more path
It's always
because God is infinite, right? Like the growth towards divinity, growth in divinity. How would you describe that path?
Well, it's interesting because at one point I found out that what is always translated as love to God in the writings of Swedenborg, or as we call it in this church, the Third Testament, in Latin is love into God. So I would say into divinity.
Oh,
So, isn't that profound?
that is really profound.
I think people didn't know what to do with it, so they just said to, but into is a much more amazing statement.
I think so. Well, especially when you kind of look at it with the larger lens that you've covered and we've covered, is you can never quite grow into God entirely, right? God is infinite.
Right.
And so this differentiation, this diversity of people growing into God, towards God, just increases the heavenliness, the godliness with creation or with the spiritual realm, etc. And
Yeah.
that's what it's all about. More of that loving connection between everything and divinity.
I like your focus on the beauty of variety and inclusiveness.
Yeah, sometimes I think, as you were describing, we get so into self. We only really like seeing images of ourselves in other people. And if they're not, even if they're really close to us, if they have a different opinion from us, especially with something we think is important, all of a sudden we get vicious. So we get, yeah.
Yeah, a wonderful human being who I care a lot about. We got into a bit of a theological argument. So, and then luckily we were like, wait, what are we doing here? So it was good in the end, but it was disappointing to have gone there, without just saying, okay,
Yeah.
we have a disagreement.
And you learn from that experience, right? Like, I hope we all do in those tough moments.
Try.
Try.
Try to.
Kind of like the alleyway, maybe, before the dawn.
I mean, and that's the third, like, seek mercy, seek to see through the delusion, but also just work against the habits and the thought the action patterns and thought patterns. And that's where we have to do it. It's not just going to happen. Even though God does it all, He does it through our own actions. So.
It's quite the reflective approach. I think through some people's experience with religion, it doesn't always seem as reflective on our own hearts and our own lives. And some it does, but I'm curious about that reflectiveness. It seems vital to this kind of allowance of divinity to work through our work to progress, to grow.
That's a good way of phrasing it. I feel that one of the blessings of the writings of Swedenborg is it's a window that allows the mind to see much more deeply about what is going on. So it invites reflectiveness, and I think that not just in the concepts given, but in the implication that we need to reflect so that we can work to change ourselves, as if so.
As if so. Yeah. I like that phrase as you use it. Wow. So I'm curious. You mentioned Buddhism, and I have a positive regard. There's a place in my heart for Buddhist practices and approaches. How would you say that's informed you? Has it mainly informed some of your practices, and also how would you say this relates to whatever your impression of Buddhism is?
I also very much appreciate Buddhism. Uh, Obviously, the practices of meditation. It's a very reflective religion, and it's ahimsa, do no harm. And I feel like, in Swedenborgianism, the first step of goodwill or loving other people is refrain from harming. It's shun evils is how it's put in the European language, but really it means ahimsa. Don't do anything harmful. So there's a strong connection there.
Which is also repeated in biblical scripture quite a bit. Stop doing harm. If only I skip that verse usually. No.
Yeah, it's nice to see there's a lot more connection between East and West religions than hits the eye.
Yeah.
For example, the name Yahuwah, which is the god of Judeo-Christianity, means isness, which is a pretty Eastern-sounding god, being itself. So there's a lot of...
Like I am.
Like I am.
There's a lot of...
I read the Diamond Sutra when it was a long time ago now, but I remember it really struck me and informed my thought. And I believe what it was talking about is how sort of spiritual relativity, so who you are and your vision of reality is going to be different than everyone else's, but we shine like diamonds, reflecting light from one another into one another. So we all are sharing our perspective and informing one another to create a network that's much bigger than any one diamond. So,
oh wow,
that's a cool idea.
That is cool.
It may be wrong. It was a long time ago, but I think that's what it was talking about.
Yeah. Well, it reminds me of like stars almost, but in a more sharing capacity, almost quantum connections. And, yeah.
And it's the same thing that you're talking about. With there's the light, which we could say is God, and then its expression is in infinite variety. So each diamond, like no one diamond can have all that light. So we bring up the variety in nature and in human beings and in the walks to God, and how that is beautiful and ever fulfilling this revelation of God.
That's beautiful. I'm curious about one thing around something you've mentioned. So you call Swedenborg's writings the Third Testament, and the first two testaments, clearly by now I think we all get our Hebrew Bible and Christian Gospels.
Old and New Testament.
Old New Testament. Now, would you, if I can get into some details here. So Swedenborg, he appreciated Paul's writings. He actually quotes Paul's letters in the Christian New Testament in some of his books. But he doesn't list those letters before Revelation as scripture in the same type of narrative internal meaning sense that he does things like the Genesis story. How do you relate to those books and that book overall?
Those books as in the letters of Paul and the other epistles?
Yeah, and then the book overall being just the Bible.
The book with all the... Well, I guess one way I've thought about it is that rather than having cut certain books out of the Bible, what Swedenborg actually has done, or he didn't do it, but what he says is that there are certain books, the majority of them, that are elevated by the fact that they have this continuous parable meaning, so that all those books that he elevates, they have a secret meaning just like a parable does. So whereas most Christians, they read the Bible as flat, so it's what you read is what you get. Well, with some application, but it's not the same parable in the same way.
it's definitely not painted that way often. Yeah.
Right. So, as for the epistles and things, there are very beautiful words in them. Um, uh, epistles of John, especially, I love.
Mm.
Um, so, and Swedenborg says they're good books for the church. Just recently, forget who it was, but they were saying that branches of the new church probably underutilize them and that we should be much more familiar with those books. So I am guilty of that too.
New church being Swedenborgian church.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, okay. Yeah, I resonate with that. And when it comes to that internal meaning as a parable, I like to connect it to Jesus's parables, which
Right.
they're called parables in pretty much every Christian church, the parables of Christ, right? And they clearly have deeper meanings than what he's saying.
Yeah.
In fact, it even says something like Christ only spoke in parable.
Right.
Right?
Yeah.
And in a way, I think of how you described it, and Swedenborg's approach is essentially taking that to heart and saying, if God speaks in parable, if Jesus is God, and God always speaks in parable, uh, maybe the texts from God are parables, right?
Right.
Not only that, but they seem to be, and they seem to work that way. They seem to have this quality to them where it lends itself for kind of a deeper exploration.
Yeah, absolutely. One amazing thing about the book of Genesis is if you start looking at what the Hebrew words mean that are given as names for the different people, like some stories, it's hard not to see that these names are there to indicate, hey, look a little deeper. We're talking about events going on in our own minds here, and it's not that I don't think it's historical. It's just God, through amazing providence, arranged for all of this to happen, to have happened in reality, time and space, but also to describe what happens up here as we walk with God. So, but yeah, some of the names in Genesis are just, it's hard to look past them.
Yeah, and some of the names in the gospel too. And I've always found it kind of amazing that most of pretty much every discoverable English translation of the Bible translates the names into like almost like a phonetic or but not the meaning. It might have it in a footnote. Sometimes it has in the footnote regularly, but often it doesn't use the meaning of the name as the name. And I feel actually quite similar that when you start looking at each of those names as its meaning, as of course they would have read it, then it becomes so clearly this deeper kind of narrative, internal narrative for us.
Yeah, that's cool.
Yeah, that's cool.
I'll have to check it out. I haven't looked into the New Testament in the same way.
Oh yeah, there's a couple examples, but yeah, I think you're right on. If only I had heard about a Bible that translated names consistently. And I don't know where I took the note, but when I went back to try to find this translation, couldn't find it.
That would be a great Bible to read.
Is that your next book? No. No, that would be cool though.
That would be cool.
If you ever feel inspired, I'll help you out. We can get it going.
All right. I don't know Hebrew or Greek, but
we could just take an existing translation that we both like or that you like, and you could just change all the names. I guess we could do that at home in a text file, couldn't we?
Yeah, we'd have to get some copyright things going to make sure we're not going to end up in jail for ripping someone's Bible.
Yeah.
But no, that would be a great thing to read.
Yeah, you're becoming a pastor, and I just became one this last year.
Congratulations again.
Thank you. I think it would be really helpful, well, not just for me, but for a lot of folks. But enough with that tangent. If you want to help with this new Bible project, you can email us. You can reach out. Are there any other projects going on for you that you're excited about?
I'm really excited to become a pastor here soon,
Mhm.
unless I really screw it up, as my head pastor likes to say.
Yeah, so what's that process like? You're working with the head pastor and a couple other folks?
Yeah, so there's Hugh Odner, who's the head pastor here. He's teaching me a few courses. And Tom Rose, who's also a very important pastor. He runs the informal service, and he's teaching me a couple courses, more focused on pastoral work and preaching than theology. And I'm studying with David Miller online, who's in Australia. And those courses have been, like you probably know the experience where you're at an edge and you know there's more, but you can't quite figure out how to see the next step of understanding what's going on. So those courses have been quite valuable in stretching my way of thinking and seeing things.
Huh.
And so that's been nice.
Sounds like a really inspired journey to be able to work with those amazing folks.
Yeah, and they are all amazing and have different wonderful things to offer.
Hmm.
And yeah, it's really enjoying my life here.
Hmm.
Good.
And your wife's here with you?
She is, and our two biological kids are here, and she had a daughter from a previous marriage. She's here too. The other are the kids we raised who were orphans. Because of Nepali law, we couldn't adopt them.
Oh.
And then to get a visa for the U.S. if you're a Nepali is very difficult.
Oh.
Basically, if you get a student visa is one way, or if you're very wealthy and have reason to go back, then that would be another opportunity. They basically say, we will assume that you're going to illegally, they do say, we will assume you will illegally immigrate, and
Oh, wow.
you have to prove to us that you're not going to. It's a pretty tall order.
Yeah.
I think they want to see that you have a very successful business that you don't want to abandon.
Huh.
So that's been hard.
That's tough.
Yeah,
Wow.
it's hard to be split up, from your own family.
I'm sorry to hear that.
Yeah.
You're able to stay connected with them and
Luckily, there's the internet.
gadgets and whatnot.
Yeah.
Good. Yeah.
Messenger. Video messenger.
Oh, that's good.
Yeah.
Well, I hope you I wish you some God's luck, good luck with continue to connect with them. Hopefully one day you can be on the same soil if you want to be.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I hope so. God has me here for now, and
Yeah.
we'll see where the future leads.
Well, so you're going to be ordained perhaps this summer, is that right?
Yeah, I'll be ordained in June, and then I'll start working as a pastor in July.
I don't know when we air this, but this is 2019. What month are we in? We're in May.
May. Yeah.
Early May, for those of you catching this when you can. So maybe you'll be ordained by the time this comes out. What do you think? Once that ordainment happens, what do you think will be the biggest relief or exciting opportunity? I have the feeling, besides maybe just working with folks here, is that counseling.
Yeah, I do look forward to that. I guess what excites me about being a pastor is getting people to experience the Lord is real. God is real in their lives, not just something you hear about at Sunday or read about, but it's a life-changing experience, when God is real.
God is
And
real and makes sense.
yeah, and has touched you with his love, and you're like, wow, this is what life's all about, and I want to give love to other people too, and make this earth as good as I can and improve it as much as I can while on the short amount of time we have here. So that's why I'm becoming passionate. I want to help create an environment and services, and pastoring or counseling is one. Traditional Sunday service is also one. It's important, but the sky's the limit, really, of how do we help people experience the reality of God's love. And so I'm already dreaming a lot of different kinds of services we can offer and practices, and
Oh, great.
so pretty excited, and hopefully at least a few will pan out.
Yeah. Wow. Well, I hope we all can find inspiration in those words. That's quite the motivation, and it was so significantly put, so well put, that I want to end on it. But first, I have to thank you so much for coming
Thank you,
on.
Cory.
Yeah.
I really have enjoyed meeting you.
Same here. I hope we stay in touch, and maybe you'll come on again if you feel like it.
Sure.
Great. Well, the book, folks, is 7 Days of Spiritual Evolution, The Genesis of Personal Transformation by Kent Rogers. And it is quite the blessing, just like this gentleman is, and so are you. So go forth, uplifting people in your own fashion, knowing that you are quite loved.
Amen.
Amen. Bye.